It's so good to be here, and just want to say welcome if you're a first-time visitor or if you're been at the church many, many years. It's just a good day to be in the house of the Lord. I have enjoyed sunny San Diego. When I was, a few weeks ago, I was watching Willie preach online, and it was like 40, 50 degrees. He was like in flannel, long sleeves. I thought, this can't be San Diego. So you're welcome for the 70, 80 degree weather that I brought from Illinois. So it's so good to be here. Willie and I was just thinking, Willie, we have been friends 20 years this year. That's a long time to put up with Willie. But in all truth, Willie and Jamie have some of the purest pastoral hearts that I've ever seen in ministry. And we have been through a lot. We've been on mission trips. We've went to Bible college together. And I just want you to show your appreciation for Willie and Jamie. You have really great, you have some great people in Willie and Jamie, and I know you know that. Well, I've been asked to continue this series called Red Letters, Words Worth Living. And if you're familiar with this series, if you've been here for the last few weeks, the red letters are sections of Scripture that are attributed to the words of Jesus. And in the New Testament, we have guys who wrote most of the New Testament, like the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul and the Apostle John. And we often quote the Apostle Peter and Paul and John, but oftentimes we forget about the most central figure in Christianity, Jesus. And so today I want to take us to a very familiar passage in Luke chapter 15. If you have your Bible or a device, or you can follow on the screen, we're going to be talking about the parable of the lost son. Now, Jesus was a masterful storyteller. He used to tell stories. He would use hyperbole. He would tell funny stories. He would tell gotcha stories. He was just a masterful storyteller. Reminds me of the story I heard about a guy who took his family and his wife and even his mother-in-law to the Holy Land. And when he was over there, his mother-in-law fell ill and died. And so he finds a local undertaker and he says, "How much is it going to cost me to ship my mother-in-law back to the States?" He says, "Well, for $5,000, we can do that. But for $500, we'll just bury her right here in the Holy Land." The guy didn't think too much about it. He said, "We'll just ship her back." And the guy said, "Hold on. That's an awful big expense. Are you sure? We'll take good care of your mother-in-law." And the guy was a little agitated. He grabbed him by the collar and he said, "Look, 3,000 years ago, you buried a guy and he came back 3 days later. I can't take that chance with my mother-in-law." Now, if your mother-in-law is here today, just give her a high five, fist pounder. It's okay. We all love good stories, don't we? We love stories about death and life. We love stories about lostness and foundness. This couple weeks ago, I read a story about a guy in New Jersey. Maybe you heard about it. He won the lottery, but he purchased these lottery tickets at a local gas station. He was on his phone. He was distracted. And so he walked out without his lottery tickets. And he gets home and he forgets them. He realized he'd lost them. So he calls the gas station clerk up and he says, "Has anyone turned in my lottery tickets?" And thankfully, a stranger turned them in. Well, the next day, he wins the lottery, $274 million. I'm sure he was thankful and rejoiced. But perhaps one of my favorite lost and found stories is about a guy who lost a cat. He says this in a lost and found poster: "Reward, if you find him and don't return him. Promise girlfriend I put up the sign. Cat's a total pain. Tears up the furniture, craps on everything. Call him if you find him and want to keep him. We'll pay cash. By the way, girlfriend will probably be an ex by the end of the night." Now, if you're a cat person, we're sorry. We're sorry that you're a cat person, because all dogs go to heaven, right? Not true. All right. We're talking about lostness and foundness today. Have you ever been lost? One of my favorite lost and found stories is found in the Gospel of Luke. The story, the prodigal son. Charles Dickens calls it the greatest story ever told. Crowder has sung about it. Kid Rock has sung about it. Artists like Rembrandt have painted about it. Now, we've commonly called it the story of Luke, in Luke 15, the story of the prodigal son. But in reality, it's a story about a compassionate father and his two sons. There's two sons in the story. It's really a story about a dad and his two boys. So I guess I've really come to say this. Here's my sermon in a sentence, right here. God is a father who rejoices when both the rebellious and the religious decide to come home. God is a father who rejoices when both the rebellious and the religious decide to come home. And now when I say father, some of us cringe at that. Because in reality, we have had negative father experiences. Some of us grew up with an absent father. He wasn't either around, or maybe he was there, but he wasn't really present. And some of us grew up with alcoholic fathers or abusive fathers, and they didn't know how to manage their pain and their hurt, and so mama and you maybe got the brunt of it. And so when we come to Scripture and God is referred to as Father, some of us, let's be honest, have a hard time dealing with that. But in Scripture, God is referred to as Father. Jesus almost exclusively refers to God every time as Father, over 165 times in the Gospels. Jesus taught us as disciples. Willie preached on this a few weeks ago in the Lord's Prayer. When we are to pray, we address God as our Father. And in Luke 15, the word Father occurs 13 times in 20 verses. It's a predominant word in our text today. But let's be honest, we have a hard time, don't we, sometimes coming to God, as we sang earlier, that he is a good, good Father when we deal with pain and when we deal with hurt. You see, God is not some father who acts like a cruel tyrant, but he's a compassionate Father. And sometimes we just think God's up in heaven and he's like a little puppet master and he's just pulling strings and he gives us blessings, and then something happens in our lives and we feel like he's just toying with us. Have you ever felt like that God's just toying with you? It's a distorted view of God. But God is a compassionate Father. And in Luke chapter 15, if you have your Bible or a device or it's on the screen, Jesus tells this parable. It's a story. Parable just is really a simple story with a spiritual meaning. Jesus tells a story, and it's really one long kind of movie with three different little scenes. And the first part of the story is this. He says a shepherd, a farmer, had 100 sheep. One wandered off, and so he left the 99. He went and found it. He brought it back home. He calls his friends, and they throw a party. And the second story goes like this. A woman had 10 coins. She loses one of them. And so she searches the house diligently to find them, and she finds it, and then she calls her friends, and they rejoice. And then the third story. There was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of my property that is coming to me." And so the father divided his property between them. A man had 2 sons. As we said earlier, traditionally we've called it the story of the prodigal son. But notice in this story that it says a man had 2 sons. He says, "Give me my inheritance. Give me what is due to me." This demanding attitude from this son. You see, inheritance came at death. Most of us know that, right? That we gain our inheritance from our parents or whoever leaves us an inheritance. We usually get that at death. But this son wants it now, while his father is still living. And according to the Old Testament law in Deuteronomy, an older son would get 2/3 of the property, and the younger son would get 1/3 of the property. But this young son says, "Pops, I want it now." And essentially, he is saying, "Pops, I wish you were dead." Now, I just want you to think about that. Just maybe your father, maybe you've got sons, But just imagine your children coming to you and say, I wish you were dead. Just give me the land. Just give me the property. So he divided his property. Now, interesting, that word for property is this little word that we get the word bios from. It means life. Tim Keller says this, that the father literally tore his life apart. He literally tore his assets and his property and all his wealth, and he just divides it and he tears his life apart. And the Jewish listeners would have been astounded hearing this. No son would have asked his father for the inheritance before he would die. It was just unheard of. But this son, in his arrogance and his brassness, decides to ask the father. So the son requests, the father responds, and so begins his rebellion. Let's continue. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had, and he took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in the country, and he began to become in need. So he went and he hired himself. The word there is literally, he attached himself. He glued himself to this person. He glued himself out to one of the citizens of that country who sent him into the fields to feed the pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate. And no one gave him anything to eat. So we have this father's response to his son's request. And so the son sets off. He squanders. He spends everything he has. And the word there is where we get the word prodigal. It's the word reckless living or loose living. It just means he spent without saving. He was carefree in his spending. And a severe famine hit. Have you ever been in life and something happens? Maybe you lose your job. Maybe you decide to go off and be a prodigal son and you just wander away from the faith and you just do your own thing. You start living your life the way you want to live it, and then it just gets worse, right? That's what happened. He went out, he squandered his inheritance, he bet the house on Vegas and he lost. And he came to the end of himself. And then on top of that, a severe famine hit. And so he thought, well, I'll find this guy and I'll ask him for a job. And so he finds this guy, and the guy gives him a job which he thought he would refuse. A Jewish guy working with pigs. If you know anything about the Jewish culture, you know that pigs are unclean, they're not kosher. It was a demeaning task for this guy to work among the pigs. It was like a hot dog on Hanukkah. Some of y'all get that in a minute. So the younger son, he starts out demanding. He becomes desperate, and ultimately he's demeaned by having to work among the pigs. But in this parable, Jesus is giving us a picture of God. You see, in stories and parables that Jesus tells, it's really, when we read them through the lens of what is God like? What is Jesus trying to tell us about the character of God, about his compassion, about his goodness, about his faithfulness? So in this parable, Jesus is giving us a picture of God. And no father would have let his son demand and shame the family name. But this father does. You see, we are all prone to wander and squander. We're all prone to walk away from God at some point. It doesn't matter if you've been in the church 5 minutes or 15 years. We're all prone to wander and squander. A friend of mine, a mentor, he's 65. He said the other day, he said, Andy, I am 65 and I'm prone to be a prodigal. You see, God will allow us to make a mess of our lives. He will allow us to play in the pig pen. God will allow us to make a mess of our lives. He will allow us to play in the pig pen. You see, sometimes we think God is just going to manipulate us and control us like a little puppet master. But no, he's a sovereign God, but he gives you free will. He gives you choice. Otherwise, he wouldn't be a good creator if he just controlled and manipulated us to do what he wants us to do. So he lets this younger son, the father, lets his son go out and make his decisions. He lets him make his choices. He was living in a foreign country. He was a Jewish boy in a Gentile nation, and he knew he didn't belong. And when the younger son no longer belonged, he longed. You see, we are prone to wander. We are prone, as we sang earlier, to find our identity in other things. We find our identity in relationships. We find our identity in our jobs. We find our identity in our 401k. We find our identity in our wealth, in our own self-entitlement. And so the younger son, when he felt like he didn't belong anymore, he did all that he knew to do. He longed. But it's one of the greatest words in the New Testament. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. When he came to himself, when he came to his senses, the NIV says. In other words, he said, this is real. Like I've hit rock bottom and my life is in shambles. I have no job. I have no money. I'm living in a foreign country and I've got family back home who love me, who care about me, and who are doing better than I am. Even the hired servants, even my father's hired people that don't even live on the family farm are doing better than me, and they have food to eat. And he arose and he came to his father. Now that word arose, just I want you to underline it, highlight it. It's a little nuanced word. And when you dig around in that word, it has resurrection language in it. You see, this story is about life and death. It's a story about resurrection. One author called the prodigal son story the gospel within the gospel. It's a resurrection story. So he comes to his senses. You remember that old song, Desperado? How many people are old enough to remember the Eagles? All right. Desperado, why don't you come to your senses? You've been riding fences for too long. Oh, you're a hard one. And I know you got your reasons. But there are things that are pleasing you that can hurt you somehow. You see, there is pleasure, Hebrews tells us, in sin for a season. How many people enjoy sinning? Come on, put your hands up. You're in church. Don't lie. Let's just be honest. Sin is fun. It's wrong, but it's fun. And Hebrews reminds us that there's pleasure in sin for a season. Eventually, the sex isn't that great anymore. And you just move on to someone else. Eventually, you run out of money. There's a time in our lives, church, when we come to our senses. The image on the screen just doesn't do it anymore. And we realize that we're in a pig pen. And we realize that we're broken and that we are shameful and that we have failed. And we long to come home. There's a line in Desperado. It says, your pain and your hunger are driving you home. That's a great line. That's good theology. I know Desperado was a love song, but that's good theology. Your pain and your hunger are driving you home. And sometimes it takes us hitting rock bottom. Sometimes it takes a relationship to end. Sometimes it takes a divorce or something that happens to us, either someone else caused or we caused by our own self-inflicted wounds. Sometimes it takes something to make us long to come home. And so he goes from give me, remember he started out demanding, give me, to make me. Have you ever tried to make something better and ended up making it worse? Have you ever come to your senses? But while he was a long way off, There's that word again. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, and he was filled with compassion. And he ran, and he embraced him, and he kissed him. And he said to his son, the son said to his father, "Father, I've sinned against you and heaven before you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate. You see, the son decided to come up with a plan. He's like, well, I'll just go home. I'll tell Pops I did this. I sinned against him. And then I'll just ask him to be a servant, maybe a slave in the family, just to make it right. And just to pay back the father and pay back my restitution. But the father cuts him off mid-sentence. And he says, bring the best robe. Bring the ring. Bring the fatted calf that we're going to kill. This is a key verse. I want to camp out here for just a few minutes. While he was still a long way off. You see, we sang earlier in Reckless Love. I love that song. I was still your foe, and you fought for me. I was still your foe, and you fought for me. Romans says, the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 5, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. You see, Jewish fathers didn't run. It was undignified. It was shameful. But this father sees him. He recognizes him. Maybe from a long way off, but he sees his gait. He sees maybe his old clothes. He says, that's my boy. I've seen him run like that. I know what he looks like. I know his walk. And he was filled with compassion. This word literally means from the gut, from the intestines. He was moved. And he embraced him. Literally, he fell on his neck. And he kissed him over and over again. You see, the Jewish culture had a ceremony called kezazah. And if a Jewish boy decided to run off and squander his inheritance, they would throw him a party, but it wouldn't be one he wanted. And so if he came back, if he decided to come back, they would meet him at the gate, and they would have these clay pots, and they would fill them with rice and beans, burnt, and they would meet him at the gate, and they would shatter the pot. And they would say, you are cut off from the community. You are no longer a son. Welcome here. You are cut off from the village. And they would throw animal feces on him, and they would shame him and humiliate him. But this father gets to his boy before the village does. He runs after him. He puts the best robe on him, which is his robe. He puts the ring on him, which was the signet ring. It meant authority. And he he kills the fatted calf. Calf was scarce. Meat was scarce. They just didn't kill cow for any occasion. It was a special occasion. And the father gets to him, and he throws his arm around him, and he hugs him, and he embraces him, and he kisses him while he is still in the pig pen clothes. There's a picture up on here, I think that's going to come up. It's a picture of Rembrandt's painting of the Return of the Prodigal Son. It's one of his most famous paintings. He painted it at the end of his life. And I don't know if we can see it very well, but you can see that the father is embracing the son while he's still in his clothes. And Rembrandt painted the picture with a Pharisee, a person that is meant to represent the Pharisee in the corner and just kind of off and judgmental and judging. And then you have a tax collector back there, and you have a person, and then you have someone in the shadow who's just kind of an image of a person who's just far enough off from God, just kind of hanging out in the shadows, just checking out God. And it's one of the most famous paintings from Rembrandt. And he painted it to give us this image of God moving toward someone who's just messed their life up, who's made horrible decisions financially or sexually. That God moves toward us. He moved toward the prodigal son while he was still in his clothes. And he didn't try to clean himself up. You see, sometimes we have this misconception in the church that we have to clean ourselves up before we come to church. We have to put on the best clothes we have. We have to get our life in order. We have to stop our addictions. We have to stop living with our girlfriend or our boyfriend. And those are good things. Those are the way that God wants us to live. But God wants us to come as we are, in our ratted, tatted clothes, in our sin, in our shame, and just come. And Henry Nouwen, he says this, and Henry Nouwen had a really profound moment in his own life when he was dealing with depression and darkness. And he used the painting of Rembrandt to really come back to God. And he says this in his book: God is not the patriarch who stays home, that doesn't move, that expects his children to come home, apologize for their behavior, beg for forgiveness, and promise to do better. To the contrary, he leaves the house. He ignores his dignity by running toward them, pays no attention to apologies and promises of change, and he brings them to the table richly prepared for him. You see, the Father showed his Son great compassion at great cost. It was the best robe. It was his ring. Shoes were given to sons, not slaves. He killed the fatted calf. Matt Chandler says this: robe, ring, ribeye. I love it. We're having cake today, by the way. We're not having ribeye, but we're having cake. And it's a good day to celebrate. We're throwing a party after church, just for the heck of it. But maybe today, we just need to throw a party for someone who comes back to Jesus. Maybe we just need to celebrate the return of some prodigals. Now I could end the message right there. We could sing the invitation hymn and just go home. But there were two sons. And so oftentimes we want to hammer on the prodigal. We want to drop the hammer on the people who are far from God and don't have their act together, so to speak. But Jesus in this parable reminds us that there are two sons. And meanwhile, verse 25, now the older son was in the field, and he came to the house. He heard music and dancing, and he called one of his servants, and he asked him what these things meant. And he said to them, your brother has come home, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has received back him safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out, and he pleaded with him. But he answered his father. He said, look. He doesn't even address him as father. He says, look, old man, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, he doesn't even address him as brother. But when this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes? I mean, how did this guy know? Was he tracking him on Instagram? How did he know what his brother was doing? He's just making stuff up at this point. He's just exaggerating. He's devoured your property with prostitutes, yet you killed a fatted calf for him. And he said to him, son, you're always with me, and all I have is yours. And it's fitting to celebrate, for this brother of yours was dead and alive. He was lost, and he's found. Now I want us to go back to the beginning of the parable in Luke chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Remember who is listening to the parable. It's very important to put this in context. Who's listening to this parable? Jesus says that the tax collectors and sinners were drawing near to him. And the Pharisees and scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives and eats with sinners. You see, this is the chief complaint of the Pharisees, the church folk. that Jesus is hanging out with people of ill repute. He's hanging out with the lame, the blind, the crippled, the sexually immoral. The tax collectors were just a group of people. They were Jews, but they worked for the Roman government. And so they would extort people. They would take more money than what was needed. And so if you were a Jewish man, you hated a tax collector. But go back to Luke chapter 5. Jesus calls Matthew, Levi. You know what Matthew's occupation was? Tax collector. And when Matthew comes to Christ or follows Jesus, we read that the Pharisees, the church folk, grumble. Luke chapter 19, Zacchaeus was a tax collector. You know the song. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. And he climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. I'm not going to sing the rest of it. I'm not going to sing at all. But you know the song. And we sing that church song. But Zacchaeus was a little man, maybe a small man, but he was a tax collector. He was a rich man. But Jesus calls him. And in Luke chapter 19, verse 1, it says, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. That's his whole mission statement. In the Gospel of Luke, the whole mission of Jesus is to seek and save the lost. And that's the whole point of the parable. That you have a shepherd who is seeking out a lost sheep. You have a woman who is seeking out a lost coin. And you have God the Father who is seeking out lost sons. Don't miss this. Lost sons. The Pharisees and the prodigals. The rebellious and the religious. The ones who are supposedly close to God and who are far from God. You see, in parables, we find ourselves in the story. And for most of the story, the Pharisees were saying, yeah, Jesus, get them. Drop the hammer on them. Yeah, you prodigals. Yeah, you sinners. Yeah, you sexually immoral. Yeah, you addicted. Yeah, you crippled and lame. Drop the hammer, Jesus. Then he gets to the older brother. And the Pharisees, the church folk, realize that, oh, he's talking about me. I'm the 99. I'm the one who's not rejoicing when someone repents. You see, Jesus got in trouble not for healing people, not for healing on the Sabbath. Well, he got in trouble for that. The church folks didn't like that either. In fact, he tells them, he says, suppose you have a donkey that falls in the hole. Wouldn't you get the donkey out? Well, yeah. Even if it was on the Sabbath? Well, yeah. And so he even challenges their own rules and the regulations. Pharisees had 613 laws that they followed. That's a lot of rules. So Jesus gets in trouble, not for hanging out, not for doing miracles, but for hanging out with outsiders, not the insiders. And whenever you read in Luke that Jesus is hanging out with the outsiders and not the insiders complain and grumble. I love this quote by Ravi Zacharias. He said, Jesus did not come to make bad people good or to make good people better, but to make dead people alive. You see, the younger son rejected God by breaking all the rules. The older son rejected the love of the father by keeping the rules. He did all the right things for the wrong reason. But the younger son rejected the father's love through rebellion. But the older son rejected the love of the father through resentment and his refusal to celebrate the younger son's repentance. This is a tough message for church folk. I am one. And this message is really just, over the last couple of months, it's really unearthed some things in me personally. How I am a Pharisee at sometimes. I can be cynical, I can be judgmental, I can be condescending, I can become arrogant. And I went to Bible college. I've been in the church for almost 20 years. You see, we all come to God as prodigals. And if we're not careful, we can become Pharisees. Oh, God. Lord, help us. Lord, help the church folk. I is one. We run this basketball league back home in Illinois, and it's just a great ministry. And we have all kinds of people from all kinds of walks of life. And the other day, we were getting trounced. I mean, we were getting beat by 20. And I'm over there pouting on the bench, just steaming mad, because the very people we invite to the league are just kicking our tail, cursing up a storm, coming in smelling like weed, living lives that who knows? And I'm just over there pouting and steaming and throwing a temper tantrum because I don't realize that the same grace that God showed me is still the same grace showed to other people. You see, we all come to God as prodigals. Every one of us entered to the faith far from God. But God showed compassion and grace to both sons. So you can play in the pig pen of pleasure, or you can pout on the porch of performance. God will meet you in the middle of your mess, or he will plead with you on the porch. He will run after you, even when you run away. Tim Keller says this in his word, Prodigal God. Each one of us, in other words, rebelled. But one did so by being very bad, and the other one by being extremely good. Both were alienated from the Father's heart. Both were lost sons. You see, the message of the parable ends with tenderness to both brothers. Come in from the foreign country of misery. Come in from the porch of hard-earned merit. Both are deadly, but inside is the banquet of grace and forgiveness and fellowship with an all-satisfying Father. You see, Willie and I played golf the other day, and he won because he wins at everything. Always has, probably always will. It doesn't matter what it is, fantasy football, fantasy baseball, basketball, the guy's just got my number. But you know what you do in golf? You keep score. I shot a pretty good game. For me, I thought, man, I'm shooting 41. That's pretty good for me for the 9. And I just lose it on the back. Shoot way over 100. Willie, 99. Right under 100. I'm not hating his golf game. I love it. I love playing Willie in golf. I love hanging out with Willie. But you see, some of us come to God like a golf scorecard. We think God is just keeping score. And we can do this in the church if we're not careful. We can keep score. Pastor called it checklist Christianity. We just check things off as we go. We go to church, check. We give our 10%, check. We serve in a small group, check. We serve kids ministry, check. We volunteer in the homeless shelter, check. We just do all these things. And I'm not saying those are very bad things. Those are very good things. But done with the wrong attitude become very bad things. And see, some of us didn't grow up with alcoholic fathers or abusive fathers or absent fathers, but we grew up with this idea that you just got to achieve. You just got to perform. You got to bring all A's home. And our identity and our love from our fathers is wrapped up in this performance-based. And when you come to God with this performance-based mentality, with this achievement mentality, because your father or your mother had this achievement mentality, you approach your faith with this performance mentality. You start checking off the boxes. Well, if I just get up in the morning at 5 a.m. and read my Bible and have a devotion and Instagram it, because that's what people do with devotions, right? You just Instagram it. So everybody else knows that you read the Bible this morning. I've done it. But you get this idea, this performance base. And we sang about it earlier in Reckless Love. I don't deserve it. That's the younger son. And I couldn't earn it. That's the older son. Or we can compare ourselves to other Christians. We can compare ourselves to other people who aren't as bad as we think we are. We start comparing our sins to your sins and their sins. It's a dangerous, dangerous place to be. You can be far from God by either sinning in pleasure or serving in pride. Oh, God. Willie said he didn't want to preach earlier. I don't want to preach right now, because I'm preaching this message to me just as I am preaching it for us in the community here. I can be a prodigal. I can be a Pharisee. It doesn't matter one way or the other. Just whatever gets life. Whatever I find life and pleasure in the moment. I can do it by serving God, or I can do it by sinning. We find life outside of God. You see, many years ago, I went through a divorce. I was married 5-6 years. We had a lot of issues, a lot of my issues I brought into the marriage and I didn't deal with. And when my wife finally left, she left and I tried to manipulate it. I tried to control it. I tried to fix it. And I still remember the day she left. I went home. There was a note, said, "This is the end." So I get in my car and I drive 30, 40 minutes down to some family where I think she's at, and I try to bring her back, and I try to reconcile, and I try to talk, and all these excuses. I'm sorry. I'm going to do this. Let's work it out. And this is months and months of marital conflict. And she's like, I'm done. And so I do the only thing I know to do. I call Dad. I say, "Dad, I really screwed up. I think it's done. I think it's over. Can you wire me some money just to come home?" It's an expensive plane ticket last minute. $800-900. Dad says, "Sure." Wires me the money. I come home. I catch a plane out of Peoria to Knoxville. And as I am descending on that airport in Knoxville, Tennessee, I just think to myself, man, I don't know. I don't know what Dad's going to say. I don't know what he's going to do. I don't know. I've shamed the family name. I feel like scum. Like I'm going to bring all this shame and dishonor on my family and all this. And so I get off the plane and I walk through the gate. And there's my dad. And he hugs me. And he embraces me. And that weekend he kissed me. And he reminded me that I'm a son. And some of you need to know that today. That you can come home to the Father who's waiting at the gate. That you can come home no matter what you've done, no matter what you're doing, no matter if you're a Pharisee or a prodigal, no matter if you're religious or you're rebelling, that you can come home. So I went home that weekend thinking I was a scumbag, and I left knowing I was a son. You see, God didn't buy you a plane ticket. He would have if that's what it would have taken. And God didn't sacrifice a cow, but he did sacrifice a lamb. The Lamb of God, the perfect sacrifice. You see, grace always costs us something. It always costs someone something. And you and I are more valuable than a sheep or a silver coin. But God saw the value in sons and daughters. You see, the love of the Father is not only invitational, it's incarnational. Paul says in 2 Corinthians that God made him, he made Jesus, who knew no sin, to be sin, so that you and I might become the righteousness of God. You see, God became Kezazah for us. He became broken. He took the shame and the humiliation and the sacrifice on himself. He became broken for us. And some of you come into this building this morning broken and feeling like you've messed up and that you're not good enough. And the message is that God rejoices when you come home. And he wants you to come. We're going to sing that song in just a few minutes. Come just as you are. O wanderer, come home. God took our sin and our shame on him. The only time in Scripture that Jesus doesn't refer to God as Father is on the cross. When he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? In that moment, Jesus was cut off from the Father. He became our sin, and God in his holiness couldn't look at Jesus in his sin. And so for just a brief moment, Jesus became our sin. The sinless Son of God became our sin and our pain. But remember that story I told earlier about a guy who was buried 3 days that came back? It's true. You see, the story of the prodigal sons is a story about life and death. It's a resurrection story. And so just in a few moments, we're going to sing as the band comes up. We're going to sing this song about coming home just as you are. Desperado, why don't you come to your senses? Come down from your fences and open the gate. Whether you're religious, whether you're rebelling, today is the day to come home back to Jesus. Would you stand? Would you sing?